Hey everybody, welcome once more to Vinyl Fridays, the only music review show in which an attempt was made to film all the episodes at one time, but I only made it through 5, and then went to bed, and forgot about it for 2 weeks. But now we're back. Nothing's transpired for you. It occurred to me when I was editing the first 5 episodes that episodes 2 through 5 were all albums which the Needle Drop, Anthony Fantano, had already given recommendations to. They were all albums that he had already loved himself, and so my videos weren't that different from his. Ultimately, I was praising them for some of the same reasons. I mean, I phrase things a little differently than he does, but I thought this show is going to get boring if we're treading too much of the ground that the Needle Drop's already covered. I mean, the reason I own most of those albums is because he recommended them. So let's talk about some albums. Let's try to focus on albums that either he's never reviewed or he didn't like that much that I actually love. So today we'll be covering one that was just before, it came out before he even started his channel, which is the album BXI by Boris with Ian Axberry. Axberry? I forgot how to pronounce it. Which is an EP. It's only 4 tracks that came out in 2010. You can see the band Boris with Ian Axberry here, who is the band Boris. I'll tell you about in a minute, but Ian Axberry is the lead singer of the 80s goth rock band The Cult, who's a pretty big band, I guess, at the time. I've never really listened to The Cult. I mostly know this because I'm a huge fan of Boris. Boris being one of my picks for one of the coolest fucking bands of all time. Boris is just one of the outright coolest bands that has ever existed. Like all Japanese bands, they are extremely prolific. They put out, sometimes they put out 4 albums in the same year. Sometimes, I mean, they guaranteed put out an album a year with rare exceptions, and have been doing so since the mid-90s. But the most important thing about Boris is that they're sort of pioneers in the fields of drone music, experimental rock, punk, all kinds of stuff. Boris are known for the fact that they put out so many albums in so many different genres that it's almost impossible to know what you're gonna get when you pull out a new Boris album. Sometimes they'll switch those genres 12 times on the same record. You really don't know what you're getting yourself into, and yet there's such a distinctive sound because the way that they tune their instruments, the devices they use, the specific instruments that they play, and the amps that they play on create a very distinct sound, which is this sort of watery, crushing, heavy, loud, noisy punk sound, which is why they are able to transition between really heavy, brutal punk. And I say punk, but like people always describe some of their albums like Heavy Rocks or Pink as being like partly punk albums, but they're so much heavier than any other punk that's out there. Like, to consider it punk, I get it because it's so unhinged and like it's just like, you know, fast, aggressive music, but it's with the tuning of heavy metal. It's with the tuning of guitars that's just so low and bass heavy that it fucking rips your fucking chest open. Like, they tune their guitars like they're in a sludge metal or doom metal band, like Electric Wizard or something, which is where I think more of their influence comes from, because they really take a lot of influence from drone bands like Sun, you know, who they've performed with many times. They have several albums with Sun. They have albums with a lot of other drone acts. So when they apply that to their more punk rock sound, then they bring these unbelievably heavy, distorted guitars into different song structures. And that's why, you know, Boris can explore all these different genres, but they totally make it their own. It doesn't sound like any other punk album. It won't sound like any other atmospheric album. They have some albums that are very light, that aren't heavy at all, but they have that distinctive guitar tone that only a band who's really worried about sound and who's you know, like a band like Sun, who's really worried about what the amps sound like, you know, could produce. They have a whole album called Amplifier Worship, for that matter. So I would say they're pretty good for if you're a what's the word, audiophile. They're a good audiophile band, not in terms of the fidelity of the sound, but in terms of creating sounds that other bands won't be able to make, because they know how to create sounds that are distinctly theirs, as is the case on BXI. And what's unique about this album, because this really doesn't sound like any other Boris album, and yet it's totally their sound, is that this is basically an alternative rock album. It's only 4 tracks again, it's an EP, but it is, and there's the track listing here on the album, it is it's essentially an alternative rock album, and I would even compare it, what's interesting about this is that Boris is a Japanese band, Japanese 3-piece, and they collaborate with a lot of American artists, and have, done a lot of U.S. tours and stuff. They're comparatively popular in America compared to most Japanese acts, and this album is done with a singer named Ian Astbury, who is the lead singer of the band The Cult. But his vocal style, he has this very deep, warbly voice. I don't know if this is how he sounded in The Cult, or if it has to do with him having aged 30 years since being in that band. But he's got this very, sort of old man, warbly, crooning almost voice, where he's like, "We are witches, come back from afar," like that kind of sound. What it really reminds me of more than anything is the collaborations that Yoko Kanno has done with Steve Conte. If you listen to a lot of Yoko Kanno soundtracks like Cowboy Bebop or Wolf's Rain or albums like that, where it's this very Japanese take on alternative rock music. This very it's not quite like J-rock sounding or anything. Boris are nowhere near that style, but I would compare it to something like the Ergo Proxy opening, or maybe even like a little Radiohead-ish, but not really. But like that sound, or early Radiohead, like that alternative rock sound that's like, not that it sounds like it could ever have played on the radio, because Boris just sounds a little too out there for that no matter what. And this definitely has the Boris guitar tone. It's like Boris's take on alternative rock. It's like if they tried to make a more structured, normal rock song with like a verse, chorus, verse sort of, and the guitar solo at the end, and it's a little bit more listenable. I could probably play this in the car with my parents and they wouldn't find it too weird. Granted, my mom listens to black metal, so maybe not the most helpful guideline, but it's not so experimental and out there that it would turn people away, the way that some of Boris's music most definitely would, either because their punk music is too aggressive for most people, or because their non-punk music, their drone, would be too, literally nothing happening for most people. So this is a good middle ground. This is probably a good, people who aren't into Boris could probably listen to this and still appreciate it. Although the fact that it's this very odd combination of this distinctive sort of watery sound, I would say that the sound of the album is what this EP looks like. Like this color scheme, that's exactly what the album sounds like. I don't know if everybody associates colors with sounds the way that I might, but this looks like how the album feels. And it's definitely odd. It's odd to hear that voice over those noises, but at the same time, it kind of comes together and forms this alternative rock sound. And again, it's a lot like Yoko Kanno working with Steve Conte, where you've got, you get the sense that this is a rock song, that there is something normal about it, but then Yoko Kanno also approaches rock music from the perspective of someone who's not from it. She approaches it like she's creating either a jazz or orchestral piece, where there's just a much greater focus on instrumentation than there would normally be in a rock song. I guess that's really what I'm getting at, is that the members of Boris are extremely talented and technical and are used to more experimental sounds. So when they create a normal structure of a song, what the actual sound of it is not what it would normally be. It's not the usual chord progressions. It's not the usual clean style of playing. It's much more distorted and warbly, and there's a lot more sound scape going on in it. if that all makes sense. So the opening track is sort of a big, sweeping, like 5-minute kind of epic feeling alternative rock song. Then it gets into track 2, We Are Witches, which is the most fun song on the album. It's sort of a straightforward, cool rock song with a fun chorus. It's got some like almost breakdown riffs in it. And then Wata, the guitarist, who is my favorite guitarist, she rips a fucking epic solo in this song, as she has often done. I would compare the way that Wata's guitar solo, or the way her shredding sounds, to like the sound of a circular saw cutting through a block of wood, but made pleasant. If that makes sense. Like, her guitar playing is like, it's really loud and almost obnoxious, except that it sounds so cool, and it always gets me pumped up. If you've never really listened to Boris, like, in this album, you know, I mean, I don't think this is like an album I'd give to somebody if I was saying, hey, here's a good introduction to Boris. Like, it's an interesting album just to listen to by itself. If I was trying to introduce you to Boris, I'd either give you I'd probably give you a combination of Heavy Rocks and Flood. Heavy Rocks for their heavy sound, Flood for their not heavy sound, and those are two of the more critically acclaimed. Or just Pink, because everyone loves Pink, and that kind of encompasses all of it. But I like Heavy Rocks more than Pink. But like, Wata's shredding is always an epic sound, and on here I would compare this album, if you're somebody who knows Boris and you've listened to a bunch of their music but you haven't heard this EP, it's comparable to Rainbow, their other collab that they did with Michio Kurihara. But track 3 on here is interesting because it's not Ian Astbury singing, it's actually Wata singing, but they're covering a song by The Cult. So it sounds like more of a straightforward, old-school goth rock song, but in the Boris style, which is really cool. It's a cool-sounding song, although Wata's vocals are... let's say that she has very shoegazy vocals, which is to say she can't sing that well, so they kind of push it into the background. She's a very shy vocalist, you know. I mean, there's other songs that she sings on their other albums in the same way as this. I like her voice. I just, you know, she's not like an amazing singer in the way that she is a godly guitarist. And then the last song on here, Magical Child, is more of a slowed down, much more typical Boris sounding song. That's sort of like a big crunching epic. It's like slow but grinding, and like these like really massive sounding riffs that Ian Astbury is crooning over, and it sort of keeps going until it just becomes more and more noisy and distorted and chaotic. So yeah, it's a cool EP. It doesn't sound like anything else that I've heard before. Again, the closest thing I could think of is like Yoko Kanno with Steve Conti, and that's only like the character of the music, not necessarily the sound of it. Like, I mean, if you listen to a lot of Boris, this sounds like Boris, but it also doesn't sound like any individual other Boris release. So it's kind of its own animal. It's really not quite the same thing as anything else I've heard, and it's definitely worth listening to for that alone. The main reason I bought this on vinyl is that in Japan, vinyl's not really a thing. Like, it doesn't have the comeback that it's had here. So there's not a lot of Japanese bands who sell vinyl or have them at all. Boris is kind of an exception because they're popular in the US, but even then they don't have a lot of it. Like, there's not a whole lot of Boris vinyls floating around. I saw this one and it was pretty cheap, so I picked it up. I mean, I like this project. It's not my favorite Boris project or anything, but it is really cool, so I do recommend it. And it's amazing to me that it took me 14 minutes to describe an album that's like less than 20 minutes long, but that's fine. Hope you enjoy it, and look forward to the next Vinyl Friday.